I'm honored to have been asked to speak, and it's great to see so many people on the call. Many of you I know, great to see you. And for those I don't know, I hope I'll have the opportunity to meet you at some point in person when this pandemic is behind us. So as Rita said, you're actually getting a twofer tonight. You're getting sort of two presentations, which I've melded together. Rita had asked me, given my background as an operational air traffic controller, both in control towers and the Area Control Center, to talk about ATC. And although I haven't been a controller for many years, I'm still a flight instructor. And so I thought what I would do is share with you some of my tips on how to get the best out of air traffic control. Now, I would say, though, that this is going to be really dedicated or directed to the either recreational or general aviation pilot, as opposed to, you know, like the airline pilot. And it's going to be focused on VFR operations rather than IFR. So just to kind of set that as the boundaries, but I'm certainly happy to answer any questions that you may have on other topics relating to ATC. But if I can't, I'll try and get the answer and get back to you at some point. The other half of the presentation, and it may not be split half and half, it may be a third, 2/3, we'll see. I'm going to talk about the Transportation Safety Board of Canada, of which I'm the chair. And so I'll give you a little bit of what I call TSB 101, who we are, what we do, how we do it. And then I'm going to talk about the statistics in terms of accident statistics in the aviation sector. I'll give you a little bit of a preview of what the 2020 year looked like. And I'm going to talk about what we have found from our investigations as being the common causes of accidents in general aviation aircraft. And then I'm going to finish off with a case study. Now, I don't know everybody who's on, and so I will tell you that this is a report that was issued today. Some of you, if you're from the Montreal area, may know about this accident. And if you knew the individual involved, my condolences for your loss. But this particular accident touches on a point which unfortunately we've seen far too often. And given that there's a number of maybe newer pilots on, I think it may be something that, that you can learn from. So as I said, I'm going to talk to you about getting the best out of air traffic control. And first of all, it starts with knowing the airspace that you're flying in. So a lot of this is very basic stuff. But maybe just before, I'm just going to go back to here. So just to give you an idea, I actually became an air traffic controller before I became a pilot. And air traffic controllers, in those days anyway, we learned a lot about air law, theory of flight, meteorology. We learned about how to read charts and so on. So as an air traffic controller, I already had a very good knowledge of the things that a pilot needs to know even before I learned to fly. And I learned to fly at the airport where I was a controller. So that was Sept-Îles Airport. That was in 1978. So I was a controller there, and I was also learning to fly there. And so because I had the knowledge of what the tower controllers, who they were, what they needed, I found it very easy to talk with them. I know that's not always the case. A lot of people feel intimidated or shy about talking to air traffic controllers. But what I found is that those who learn to fly in an airport with a tower are much more at ease flying into other airports with towers, but less at ease flying into uncontrolled aerodromes. And similarly, those who learn to fly at an uncontrolled aerodrome where there's no tower, no flight service station, find it more difficult to fly into an airport with a tower. So I now operate out of Rockcliffe Airport, east of Ottawa. We don't have a control tower, but we're surrounded by controlled airspace. And so we have an opportunity to do both uncontrolled and controlled procedures with towers and FSS. So all this to say, if you aren't used to flying in towered airports and you feel uncomfortable, it's normal. It's understandable. There's nothing to be afraid of. You just need to get the experience. And so I hope what I cover tonight will give you some of the tips. So let's go back to the first slide. So first, it's about knowing what airspace you're flying in. So whether you're on the ground or you're in the air, you always need to know what type of airspace are you flying in. Is it C, D, E, F, or G? Now you notice I left out A and B. A and B are higher level airspace that are primarily for aircraft flying in accordance with the instrument flight rules. And that's why I'm not going to talk about them tonight. But C is controlled airspace, typically with a tower, but higher density traffic. So an example would be Ottawa or Toronto Pearson. You may be able to think of others in your area. And Class C airspace, you need to get permission to enter. It also applies to things like terminal control areas. So Class C is sort of, for your purposes, the highest level of control that you can expect, whether it's an airport control zone or whether it's a terminal control area. Class D, those tend to be also airports with control towers, but less dense traffic. I think Oshawa is an example of one that comes to mind. Quebec City was, I don't know if it still is, but there are a lot of airports in the area that have control towers. They're Class D. The main difference there is you have to establish two-way contact before you enter the airspace. Class E is also controlled airspace, and typically you would find that where there's an active flight service station or airport advisory service. The important thing about C, D, and E is they all require a minimum of 3 miles visibility and 1,000-foot minimum ceiling as VFR minima. So if you want to take off from those areas, you need at least 3 miles visibility and a ceiling of at least 1,000 feet above ground. F is special use airspace. So that includes restricted airspace. We have a couple of restricted airspaces here around Parliament and around the Governor General's mansion. You don't want to fly into that airspace because if you do, you may or may not get intercepted. You will probably be, find yourself with a fine or some explaining to do. So, but then there's also alert areas, which are also special use airspace, also Class F. So that would include things like flight training or parachuting or gliding, where you can go through it. It's better to avoid it if you can because of the nature of the activity, but you can go through it. It's just you have to exercise extra vigilance. And because of the nature of the activities that are in there. And of course, Class G is uncontrolled airspace. And there, the minimum visibility for VFR operations is 2 miles, and you have to remain clear of cloud. So how can you find out? Typically, for the airports, the aerodromes where you'll be operating, it's in the Canada Flight Supplement, or also on the VFR terminal area charts and VFR navigation charts. Whether you use paper charts or electronic charts like ForeFlight, doesn't matter. That's where you can find out the class of airspace that you're going to be operating in. And it's really important that you be familiar with that because that's what defines the rules of the air, the minimum VFR requirements to fly there, etc. So tip number one. And I'll give you an example. The other day I was up and I was actually flying north of Gatineau Airport. And it was in an area that I wasn't quite familiar with in terms of the boundary between the Gatineau control zone, the Ottawa terminal airspace. And I was really glad that I had, a Garmin 430 with a GPS open and I could see where that nice line was. And I could make sure that, I was at the appropriate altitude in the appropriate airspace, and I didn't get into trouble by going into Ottawa's airspace, in their airspace and without talking to them and getting permission. When you look at airspace, you have to look both at the lateral and the vertical boundaries. So most control zones are kind of cylindrical shaped, but some of them may be oddly shaped. So make sure that you're aware of what the lateral boundaries are, which again, they're shown on your GPS, they're shown in ForeFlight if you're looking at, and they're shown on the paper, the paper charts. So make sure you know what the lateral boundaries are and make sure you know what the vertical boundaries are. And sometimes it can be hard, like Ottawa, the Ottawa-Gatineau area is one of the most complex airspaces in Canada, not because it has a high volume of traffic, but because of the boundaries of the control airspace and the differences between the Ottawa control zone, the Ottawa terminal area, the Gatineau control zone, Rockcliffe Airport, which is uncontrolled. And when you look at all the lines on the map and the different floors at which the different areas start, it can get really complex. So if you don't want to go into somebody's airspace where you shouldn't be without permission, make sure that you really familiarize yourself with the airspace, both the lateral and the vertical boundaries. Yeah, so just as I said, knowing the airspace, the C, D, E, F, or G, knowing the lateral and vertical boundaries is one thing, but then you also need to know what rules and services are applicable. All of this information is very easy to find and well laid out in the Aeronautical Information Manual produced by Transport Canada that you can download. Just Google it, Aeronautical Information Manual, and It will explain all that. But the main thing when we're talking about C, D, and E airspace is it's likely a situation where, well, it's always a situation where VFR weather minimum apply, 3 miles visibility, 1,000-foot ceiling, and you usually have to talk somebody. So the other thing I wanted to talk about though is MF versus ATF. So a mandatory frequency means you must have a radio. Unless you get special permission in or without, you must have a radio. And most of the CD, in fact, all of the CD and E airspaces are designated mandatory frequencies. And I'm going to show you where to find that information at the end. But if it's a mandatory frequency, you must have a radio and you must communicate on that radio. And if it's an ATF, aerodrome traffic frequency, then a radio is highly recommended, but isn't required. So what that means is if it's an ATF, technically somebody could be operating in there without a radio. So you better keep your eyes open. Example of that is Rockcliffe Airport that has an ATF. Again, that information is all available in the CFS. So what are the types of air traffic services? It's a whole buffet of services. So as I said, Class C or D airspace will be staffed by a control tower. And again, you'll find that information in the CFS. And typically they have, ground control and air control. They have designated frequencies. And of course, you have to get permission to operate. They'll give you clearance for takeoff or landing, and they'll give you permission to operate in it. Some airports have an on-site flight service station that provides an airport advisory service. So an example of that would be Kingston or Gatineau. And I'm sure you can think of others. So they have an on-site flight service station. They provide advisory service, so they can't clear you to land or take off, but they will give you weather information. They will tell you the runway that's active, and they'll also give you things like the altimeter and the wind conditions. And they'll also help you help point out any traffic they may see. We also have something called a remote airport advisory service. So that's the same thing. It's given by a flight service station, but they're not physically on site. And I'm going to give you an example of that later. Some of you may be familiar with flight information centers. They are located at strategic places across Canada, but you typically call them to get a weather briefing, find out about NOTAMs, file a flight plan, and you can also contact them in the air because they can provide you with updated weather and NOTAMs, PIREPs. They can give you flight following, but they don't have radar in the flight information center. Some of the airport advisory services do have radar, like Kingston has radar, Gatineau has radar. But the remote airport advisory services may or may not have radar. The flight information centers don't, so they're not tracking you in the air, but they can certainly give you a lot of information. And then of course you've got the area control centers, and there's 7 of them across the country. They are responsible primarily for separating IFR traffic, but they can also provide flight following services. And your terminal control units, like in Toronto, in Ottawa, and in some of the other major places in the country, are usually physically embedded in the area control center, but they have their own unit and their own frequencies. So just to give you an idea, there's a whole range of services that are provided by ATS. I hope that many of you will already have visited either a control tower or a flight service station or an area control center. If you haven't, and of course it wouldn't be possible now due to COVID, but if you haven't, I strongly recommend that you do, because it's really helpful and informative to do that. Okay, so let's talk about communications, because obviously, you're in your airplane, they're on the ground, and you have to talk to each other. And the only way we can do that is through radio. Now that's not quite true, because we now have data link communications where you can actually communicate with air traffic control via text message over data link. But I'm gonna stay out of that for now, because we're going to focus on GA and on VFR operations, where it's almost done entirely by radio. So the most important thing is when you want to talk to somebody, and it doesn't matter whether you're on the ground or in the air, and you want to call the tower, or you want to call the center, or you want to call a flight service station or the flight information center, the first thing you have to do is ring their bell, right? So people are ringing their bell to get in here. So you have to ring their bell. So how do we do that? By an initial contact. So you would call Ottawa Tower. This is Golf Alpha Bravo Charlie. Kingston Radio. This is Golf Alpha Bravo Charlie. Montreal Center. This is Golf Alpha Bravo Charlie. So that's your way of getting their attention, your way of getting their attention before you go into a long spiel about what you're going to do. So that's the initial contact, and it's really important to wait. Now, let's say that you call and you don't get a response. I mean, give them, give them a little bit of time, give them 30 seconds to a minute, and then try again. However, before you call like 2, 3, 4, 5 times, I would encourage you to make sure you're on the right frequency and your volume is up. I have been guilty as an instructor of turning down the volume on my radio, and then I call ATC and I don't get a response, and I call them again and I don't get a response. And then when I do get them, they say, anyway, I get an earful, polite earful. But so just make sure that you're on the right frequency and that your volume is turned up. But once you have established contact, and maybe they'll come back to you and say Alpha Bravo Charlie, squawk ident or squawk code, whatever. So do that, squawk ident, if you're asked to do that. But otherwise, your next contact should be in this kind of format. So it's, and I'll give you an example. So let's say that I'm in the air, and I'm calling Gatineau radio. So I'd say Gatineau radio, the Cessna 172, Golf Alpha Bravo Charlie, over the Ottawa River at 1,200 feet, 5 miles south of Gatineau, inbound for circuits. So I've given them my type, I've given them my ident, I've given them where I am, and because I'm in the air, they also need the altitude, and I've told them what I want to do. So all of your communications, whether you're on the ground or in the air, should always follow that format. Type, ident, your position. If it's on the ground, then you'd say, well, I'm at the Sky Service, and I want a taxi for departure on a VFR flight plan to Kingston. If you're at a controlled airport that has an ATIS, an Automatic Terminal Information Service, then please indicate that you've listened to the ATIS by indicating the message. So I have ATIS Charlie, or I have ATIS, Foxtrot. Notice I said for the aircraft ident, 4 letters. So, Fox, Alpha Bravo Charlie, Golf, X-ray Yankee Zulu, it's 4 letters, because of course in Canada, all of our aircraft that are, our airplanes and helicopters have a C and then a -G or a -F, or in some cases a CF-, but they all have those 4-letter with an F, 3 letters, or a G. And again, I'm not going to get into ultralights and balloons and all those things, but the point is you need to give your 4 letters. So now it's possible that at some point, if there's communications back and forth, it's possible that the tower or the unity or the unit that you're speaking with may reduce to 2 letters. And if they do, then you can, but don't shorten your ident unless they do. Okay. So in terms of, okay, so what do I tell them? So we already said you do an initial contact, you give them that format of information we just talked about. So then they come back to you, they give you a whole bunch of information. So what do you need to repeat? So in terms of repeating, you don't have to repeat everything they said to you. In fact, they will not like it if you repeat everything they say to you, because you're taking up valuable frequency time, and frequency congestion, it can be a huge problem in a dense environment. So only repeat the critical information. So for example, if I had the controller come back to me and say, Alpha Bravo Charlie, not above 2,500 feet, traffic at your 2 o'clock, 4 miles opposite direction, and oh, by the way, the altimeter is 3022. I would only repeat not above 2,500 feet, because that's what the controller wants to hear, wants to know that you've got that restriction. And then you could also add looking for traffic or traffic in sight, those sort of things. But you don't want to repeat everything the controller has said to you, because you're just eating up valuable frequency time. So things like hold short instructions. If you're told hold short of runway 26, you must repeat that instruction. But if you're given a bunch of other information, you don't have to repeat it. But anything that's a restriction, like you don't have to repeat the altimeter setting. So just, if you're not sure, repeat, but generally you only repeat restrictions.